I think the one that's just come out is more relevant to all of us, than the earlier ones, because it's about the nuclear confrontation, and it's about the silly things that people say and might do with their great big buttons. And so I think it is rather relevant, and anybody who wants it can buy it on Amazon. Thoroughly recommended, at least by me. And what I'm writing now, which I've just started, is a new book about Russophobia, which I think is a very interesting subject. Why on earth it is that the relationship between particularly my country and Russia has always been so bad. It's very bizarre, considering we're a long way from one another, and Britain has never been invaded by Russia. Russia, of course, has been invaded by Britain. So what is all that about? And at the moment, I'm trying to work out why the baptism of Vladimir the Great is still relevant today. When you think about it, it's a pretty bizarre thought, but it is still relevant today, and I'm learning a lot. But today's talk is about something completely different. It's about Brexit and Britain and the European Union. And since one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the huge ignorance in this country amongst everybody about what the European Union actually is and how it works, ignorance which isn't actually confined to this country. Most people on the continent haven't got a clue how it works. So I thought I'd just say what my credentials were, and that is that I did spend quite a lot of my career working on the European Union, especially in the early years. I was both in London and Brussels dealing with it, and I was involved in managing the referendum in 1975, and I voted to stay in 1975, and I voted to stay in 2016. So that's my qualification for talking about this subject. Well, on the 18th of June 2016, the British people went to the polls in unprecedented numbers. The turnout was very high, and they chose to leave the European Union. Or rather, more accurately, 52% of those who voted to leave, and 48% voted to stay. Now, the Brexiteers, the people who campaigned to leave, called that result a great victory for democracy. They said that the British people had made a historic choice. And the anti-European press, there are several really virulent anti-European newspapers in this country, called anybody who disagreed with them traitors. When in a country you hear the word traitors in the political dialogue, you know something's going badly wrong. Not only in this country, it's not very usual in this country for people to call one another traitors, but when they do, you know things are going wrong. Of course, that claim by the Brexiteers that it was a historic democratic choice was, in fact, a profoundly anti-democratic proposition, because in a genuine democratic system, the views of the minority, the people who lose the election, are respected by the majority, and the system always allows for a vote to be reversed at a subsequent election. Hitler won an election, a democratic election, fairly, and then he refused to allow any more elections to take place, and nobody thinks Hitler was a Democrat. But, in my view, the Remainers, the people who voted to stay, also weren't particularly democratic. They said that those who voted to leave were ill-educated, ignorant, provincial, a bunch of ignoramuses bamboozled by the anti-European press. a sort of lumpen proletariat. But, and I'll go on to talk about that, the views of the Brexiteers, the people who wanted to leave, were not trivial. They were serious, even if you think they were wrong. And as far as ignorance is concerned, the point I made right at the beginning, I don't believe those who voted to stay in were any less ignorant about what the EU actually is and how it actually functions than the people who voted to leave. There's a lot of ignorance on both sides. So the referendum didn't show that the British people had made a final and definite choice about their place in Europe. On the contrary, it showed that they were still unable to make a clear choice on a matter of central national importance, on which they'd been deeply divided for 70 years. I think the other thing that the vote demonstrated was the extent of Britain's, I use words carefully, I mean Britain, of Britain's identity crisis. I have, in previous meetings at school, pointed out that the British identity crisis is actually very similar to the post-Soviet identity crisis, because we have a lot of common problems when you think about it. But we have been for some time, it's to do with loss of empire and things like that, been asking ourselves, who are the British? They're not the English, they're not the Scots, and they're not the Welsh, and they're not the Irish. And how do you describe our fellow citizens who are none of the above, who come from Pakistan or Africa or the Caribbean? One of the things about the vote in 2016 was that the English voted by a large majority, by a genuine majority, to leave. But the Scots voted to stay, and the Irish voted to stay. So what does that mean about the unity of the country we still call Britain, or the United Kingdom? Now, all this has a very long history, and I think if you want to understand what's happening now, you have to know what that history is. British hostility, the hostility in this country, towards the European project and the divisions that that has produced in both political parties, and one thing that I emphasize is both political parties are deeply divided on the question of Europe. It bubbles up and down in the two parties depending on circumstances, but it's always there. Those doubts and those divisions go right back to the beginning. Winston Churchill, everybody always quotes Winston Churchill. He was very clear on the subject. He made a historic speech in Zurich in 1946. I regret to say I was in Zurich at the time and saw the crowds welcoming him. And he called on the continental Europeans to unite. He said that that is the only way to put behind them all the horrors of the past two world wars and so on, would be if they united, particularly the Germans and the French. But he made something entirely clear at the time, which was that Britain thoroughly approved of the idea of European unity, but it was not going to be a part of it. His view was that Britain was a world power. Britain had interests throughout the world, not only on the continent, so we would not join in. Then, over the next 15 years, the European project started to look as though it was going to work, that it would be successful. And Harold Macmillan, another Conservative Prime Minister, concluded that Britain couldn't afford to stand aside from this project of developing power and influence on the continent of Europe. His principle was, if you can't beat them, you'd better join them. And so he applied to join. in 1961. And his negotiations very nearly succeeded. They were highly technical, they were very difficult, but they'd got almost to the point of success when, in 1962, General de Gaulle vetoed the British application. And his grounds are, the grounds he gave are important and interesting and, in my view, still relevant. What he said was that the British were too different from the continental Europeans. Britain looked towards the world outside, to the ocean, and to America. He did say that he hoped that with time, the British might eventually choose to what he called more alongside the continent, but he clearly didn't believe it. So a few years later, Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, applied again in 1967. And once again, the application was vetoed by General de Gaulle. So that's 2 vetoes. The bride twice going to the church and finding that the marriage was not going to take place. That was actually a very humiliating situation for the British to find themselves in, and they were increasingly desperate to get into the EU, and another Conservative Prime Minister, Edward Heath, succeeded. We did get into the EU in 1975. Now, some of those who were involved in that negotiation, and quite a few of Heath's people, thought that we had got a very bad deal in our original treaty with the European Union, particularly on the financial side. The chief negotiator official, who was, of course, very anxious to get us in, said, when he wrote up the history a year or 2 later, that we would have to renegotiate the financial deal because it was so inequitable. That's right at the beginning. Now, Harold Wilson had been out of office for a while, but he got back in again in 1974. And his party, by then, at a party conference, had voted to leave the European Union unless the terms of entry, the treaty, was substantially renegotiated. Now, Harold Wilson was a very clever, in my view, rather good politician, and he outmaneuvered his opponents inside the party, negotiated a revised deal, and then, as he'd promised, he held a referendum, the one that I was mixed up in 1975. The vote at that referendum was 2/3 in favour of staying in the European Union. Now, I thought that that would settle the matter, the 1974. The British had made it clear that they wanted to stay inside, and although they didn't like the European Union, I thought, it was just about that time I went to work in Brussels on these matters, I thought that the British would become reconciled over the years to membership. And of course I was quite wrong, they didn't become reconciled. So one of the questions is, was the result of the referendum in 2016 a surprise? A lot of people were surprised. In my view, at the time, before the referendum and afterwards, I thought they were wrong. Given the history, they shouldn't have been surprised. Now, the anti-Europeans were led by a very well-organized and determined and ruthless and obsessive set of individuals who systematically made life miserable for any British Prime Minister who was trying to live with the European Union. I was working for John Major at the time. They made it particularly difficult for him, and they did the same for his successors. going back to what I said earlier about ignorance and people having a right to their own point of view in a democracy, the objections of these people to British membership were fundamental. They absolutely rejected the goal of European federation, which is a goal of a large number, or still a substantial and significant group of people on the European continent. They disliked the way that European law took preference over British law, and they wanted to, what they called, take back control from Brussels and restore British sovereignty. One of the things that they argue is that none of these issues was properly debated at the time of the first referendum, that the British people were lied to by the government and told that these things were not inherent in the European project. That, as a matter of fact, is untrue. The anti-European case in 1975 was put very ably and eloquently by members of Harold Wilson's own government. All the issues were laid out in 1975 as they were in 2016. But it's not only a question of what you might call objective matters, of solid, reasoned objections. It goes much more deeply than that, in my view. A friend of mine was a close advisor of Harold Wilson's in those early days, and he objected to Harold Wilson's bid to join the Union. He maintained, my friend, that Britain's history, its religious traditions, its legal system, were all profoundly different from those of the Continentals. All the continental members of the European Union at that time had suffered defeat during the war, occupation by an enemy, and the destruction of their pre-war political systems. The British hadn't. The British had survived the war with their institutions intact and emerged victorious. So why did, my friend asked, why did we think we could join in an alien political project, the European Union? Why could we do that successfully? Now, whether you agree with those arguments or not, my point is that they weren't trivial and that they were not based on ignorance. But there are some other things about the vote in 2016. Two other things. First one is, of course, questions which were not actually strictly relevant to the question of our membership of Europe. The rise in immigration, the growing inequality between the rich and the poor in this country, and the contrast between a booming and cosmopolitan London and the rest of the country. Now, although those things were, of course, not relevant to the membership of the European Union, they were, just as the European issue was, for many voters, further evidence that our politicians are simply not listening to them. And that helped to increase the anger that they brought to that vote. But there's another thing also, not particularly connected with Europe, but also fueled the voting. And that was our confusion, the British confusion or illusion about Britain's place in the world. I'm sorry to keep going back into history, but I don't believe you can understand what's going on if you don't know your history, whether you're British or Russian or whoever you are. You have to know what happened before. In 1963, the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said that Britain had lost an empire but had not yet found a role. It was a remark that infuriated the British, even though, of course, it happened to be, and in my view still is, true. 1963, when he made that remark, was also the year in which de Gaulle vetoed British entry into the European Union. Now, what's happened since then, in my view, not in the least surprisingly, is that Britain has continued its slow but inescapable loss of power. Many British people refuse to accept that. They say, look at us. They say, we're a nuclear power. We have the most amazing professional armed forces. We have these close links with America. And all of that enables us to carry a disproportionate influence on world affairs. They call it punching above our weight. That's a metaphor from boxing. And if a boxer goes into the ring and punches above his weight, that's to say he's smaller than the man he's fighting against, he usually loses. It's not a good thing to try and do, punch above your weight. But these feelings about Britain's place in the world and our nostalgia for the past were tapped into by those who were managing the Brexit campaign. They claimed that outside the European Union, Britain would resume its rightful place as a world power. Countries from the Commonwealth, they were able to distinguish between the British Commonwealth and the British Empire, although sometimes some found it difficult. Countries from the Commonwealth would queue up to sign favourable trade deals with us. We would go on being America's closest ally, the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. The Europeans would need us more than we needed them, and we would put the great back in Britain, a phrase which has been plagiarized by the current leader of the United States of America, who's putting the great back in America, in Davos, as we speak. But of course, a lot of that was pure fantasy. The idea that we were going to be able to go back to the past. And it was a shock to the new British government under Theresa May when they took over in the summer of 2016, when they began to have to work out and discover how the European Union really did work and how weak the British negotiating position in the European Union really was. And they still haven't come to terms with it. I mean, today, again, in the newspapers, there's a row reported, another split inside the Prime Minister's cabinet, with the two factions shouting at one another. The fantasists still talking about leaving and putting the great back in Britain, and still no identifiable government policy about how we should negotiate our future relationship with the European Union. So what next? Well, the negotiation's due to continue for another year until March 2019. And the present view of the government is that Britain will then leave the EU, and depending on which particular member of the government you talk to, either will be or won't be thereafter in some kind of transitional arrangement until we've sorted things out and become completely separate. Now, there are those who believe, Remainers, people who voted for us to stay, who believe or hope that Britain still has a choice. They point to the polls, who've proved so reliable in the past about what the British people think. They point to the polls which seem to show a shift in mood as people realize what the disadvantages of leaving the European Union could be, will be. So they are talking rather optimistically of the possibility of a second referendum or a parliamentary vote, which would reverse the decision to leave. I'm sceptical about that. The polls are very complicated, of course, and not necessarily reliable, but one of the things they seem to show is that although the Brexiteers, the people who voted to leave, may now be beginning to realise what the price is, they are still inclined to say that it's worth it. We want to get out of this thing and we're prepared to pay the price. And the conclusion I come to, and colleagues of mine get cross with me for saying it, people who worked the whole of their careers on the European Union, the conclusion that I come to is that de Gaulle was right, that the British really are very different from the Continentals, and that they really have a fundamental problem about adapting to the European project. And so therefore, I think that even if a second referendum were held, and even if it did make a different choice and went the other way, and the British therefore did stay in the European Union, I personally don't believe that would end the problem. I think a large body of opinion in this country would continue to dislike the Union and cling to the illusion of greatness, and that they still would not accept that geography and history compel the British to cooperate with their European neighbours, whether they like it or not. So the disarray would continue, the problem would continue just as it has for the last 70 years. I'm not going to make any firm predictions. I think in the present state of the world, making predictions about the future is even more foolish than it usually is, even in calmer times. But I do think the British are going to leave. We will, of course, not disappear off the face of the world. We will continue to be a large country, very close to the European continent. And we'll doubtless, both sides will want to, and they will probably succeed in finding some sort of working relationship. I don't think there's much alternative. But the British won't any longer have a significant voice in the affairs of the European Union. And that is a historical change, because the British have always taken the view for hundreds of years that they have to have, even if they don't join in European institutions, they have to have a significant and preferably a decisive voice in the affairs of the continent. They will lose that. And the British show very little or perhaps no sign that they have either the will or the resources to go on punching above their weight. At present, we have a country that has no identifiable foreign policy and no identifiable defense policy and no identifiable security strategy. And I think that if we leave, when we leave, we will be a diminished country. Now, ironically enough, that is not an outcome, not the outcome that either side in the referendum debate was looking for. The Leavers thought we would be more powerful if we left, and the Remainers thought we'd be more powerful if we stayed. And it may be, it was Liana who suggested I talked about Britain's choices. It may be that, in fact, in real life, countries never do make clear choices. They just stumble from one muddle to the next muddle. And it isn't until the historians come along and start writing the history that you can see what the choices were, and everything looks, if you look backwards, much simpler than it seemed to those who were involved at the time. Thank you.